If you have MS, you've been told about inflammation. But here's what we're finding, that there's more going on with inflammation than we thought at first. It causes more problems than we originally thought it did. And also, it can be affected by the choices we make. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam. I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 39 years. Just recently, I started subscribing to an online newsletter called Multiple Sclerosis News Today. And I will tell you, this thing has been a bevy of information about what's going on. So you're going to see me go back to that a number of times in videos because I'm just finding out things that some of my other newsletters are not as quick to pick up on, if they ever do at all. Today's topic really is one that I don't think I've ever made a video about before, but it's common to almost all of us with MS, inflammation. Now, the first thing we want to do before we get too far into that discussion is define what inflammation actually is. And I thought, well, who better to give us an idea of inflammation and multiple sclerosis than the National MS Society. Here's what they say. MS is a chronic inflammatory disease of unknown etiology, so we don't know what causes it, that involves an immune-mediated attack on the central nervous system. Myelin and the oligodendrocytes that form myelin appear to be the primary targets of the inflammatory attack, although the axons themselves are also damaged. The inflammatory attack on the central nervous system white matter is associated with T lymphocyte activity, Th1 and Th17, impairment of regulatory T cell function and B lymphocyte activity, antibody and complement. Gray and white matter are targeted by the abnormal immune response. The collective damage to white and gray matter results in a broad spectrum of clinical signs and symptoms. So basically, inflammatory responses are an immune response, a reaction that our body mounts in the presence of something it perceives to be an invader and a threat. I'd like to look at a couple of articles that I found because they talk to us about aspects of inflammation that maybe you knew about, maybe you didn't, but it's good that we're all on the same page, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at what I found. This first article describes an article about diet and inflammation, and it's called Diets Promoting Inflammation May Slowly Lead to Depression and Anxiety. It says that studies suggest that food choices can affect mental health over the long term, and this came out in January 25th of 2024, so again, quite recent. I will not go through this whole article, however, let's look at a few items here. It says that foods that promote inflammation appear to contribute to the development over time of depression and anxiety in people with multiple sclerosis. A study that followed patients for 10 years reports. A pro-inflammatory diet, however, was not linked to fatigue, a common MS symptom. Would that it were, because that would be a relatively simple way to fix your fatigue, wouldn't it? And they say that if the relationship with depression and anxiety is causal, then the longer-term consumption of anti-inflammatory diets could be recommended to decrease depression and anxiety symptoms in people with MS, the researchers wrote. And the name of the study is A Pro-Inflammatory Diet is Associated with Long-Term Depression and Anxiety Levels, but not fatigue, in people with multiple sclerosis. And it appeared in Multiple Sclerosis and Related Disorders. You can click on the link there and get to it, but I'll also link to it in the description so that you can get right to it if you want to. And I will say, by the way, that this is actually in press as of January. It was not yet actually public except online. And when it comes out in a journal, it may well be something that you have to pay for to see. So it might be a good idea to check it out if you're interested. Skipping down here to this paragraph, although evidence does not support any specific MS diet, dietary approaches for the disease have been developed that generally aim to provide for the body's nutritional needs and support a healthy gut microbiome, the collection of intestinal microbes thought to influence the immune system. And that's something we've heard many times, is that there are many diets out there, and a number of them are helpful with MS. A number of them have a lot in common. The Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis diet is actually a modified version of the Swank diet that was popular in the later part of the 20th century. And there's the Walls diet, and there's many other ones. If you look at them, they all seem to stress some basic similarities, though some say you can eat certain things and some say you can't. Avoiding things like processed food always seems to be a part of any of these diets. And we'll look in a minute here at some specific types of food that might be beneficial. But this is just, again, saying that no one specific diet seemed to be the magic bullet. In the general population, mental health disorders have been associated with systemic inflammation, and dietary components are a determining factor of postprandial or post-mealtime inflammation, both acutely and chronically, the researchers wrote. However, no studies have examined the association between dietary-associated inflammation and depression, anxiety, and fatigue in people with MS, a group known to be at elevated risk of these conditions. And skipping down to near the end of the article, it says that the study did not specify what food types or consumption levels associated with higher DII or EDII scores. Researchers, however, found no link between dietary inflammation scores and fatigue assessed using the fatigue severity scale. They're also saying that the use of disease-modifying treatments was not seen to modify the association between dietary inflammatory indices at the 5-year follow-up, or to cause a change in depression and anxiety over the next 5 years. Our findings suggest that it is the long-term accumulation of chronic inflammation mediated by foods that is important, rather than the immediate effect, the researchers concluded. Immune system modulation may occur via postprandial inflammation, altering the composition of gut microbiota, and via systemic inflammation, and this may be important in increasing the subsequent risk of anxiety and depression. This is an important point, I think. What they're saying is you can eat any one food one time, and it's not going to immediately cause inflammation. It's the chronic long-term accumulation of inflammation that is caused by the foods that we eat. So how we eat as a general rule, what is our practice of eating? What types of foods do we eat? What types of foods do we avoid? And those are the things that are going to help the anxiety and the depression that we might be feeling. Definitely worth looking into. The next article that I found actually targets something specific, as opposed to the earlier one that said just in general to avoid foods that are inflammatory. This specific study is looking at one particular food item that we can eliminate that might help us. And the article is titled, "In MS, Diet Low in Wheat May Ease Inflammation and Improve Life Quality." Pilot trial research on reducing wheat show benefits in patients and in mice. So isn't it nice to know that you and mice are all in the same boat together? But I guess what they're saying is that they had a trial and a pilot. One was in mice, one was in people. And this, again, published on January 24th, 2024, so very recent. The article says that a diet low in wheat was linked to reductions in circulating inflammatory immune cells and improvements in pain-related life quality among a small group of people with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, according to findings from a pilot clinical trial conducted in Germany. And my guess is that they may have chosen people with relapsing MS just because any intervention is likely to show some effects sooner than it would in progressive MS, which tends not to have relapses, tends not to have specific attacks. it will take longer to find out whether an intervention is doing any good. But I think that when it comes to diet, my gut feeling, no pun intended, is that if it's good for people with relapsing MS, it's good for people with all kinds of MS. That's just my thought, but it seems to make sense. It says that the trial's findings build upon another recent study from the team where it was identified that non-gluten proteins naturally found in wheat, called amylase trypsin inhibitors, exacerbated disease severity in a mouse model of multiple sclerosis. These wheat proteins also increased populations of inflammatory immune cells in the central nervous system and comprised of the brain and spinal cord. Until now, there was no clear evidence that a wheat-containing diet can also influence inflammatory diseases of the central nervous system. Detlef Schuppan, MD, PhD, a professor at Harvard Medical School in the US and the University of Mainz Medical Center in Germany, said in a university press release. We have now been able to show, both in an animal model and in a clinical pilot study, that the ATI proteins in wheat can enhance the severity of MS, Schuppan said. Results from the trial were detailed in a study titled Attenuation of Immune Activation in Patients with Multiple Sclerosis on a Wheat-Reduced Diet, a pilot crossover trial, which was published in the journal Therapeutic Advances in Neurological Disorders. And again, I will link to that article directly, though you can certainly get to it from clicking on this article. And this is interesting. A lot of us have heard about gluten as a culprit. Many of us are on a gluten-free diet, but they've also said here that they're identifying that gluten is not the only wheat protein that's at issue in inflammation. They say it has become increasingly recognized that dietary components may influence MS risk, severity, and progression by altering the gut microbiome, the collection of microbes living in the gastrointestinal tract, and promoting the movement of inflammatory immune cells into the brain. Wheat, though the most widely consumed food staple globally, is difficult to digest and known to cause inflammatory intestinal reactions. This largely has been attributed to gluten, the most abundant protein in wheat. About 1% of people worldwide have celiac disease, a condition in which reactions to gluten proteins cause intestinal inflammation. These results show that gluten is not the only problem, according to researchers. What is new is that other wheat proteins can generally contribute to inflammation. Emerging evidence indicates that ATIs, proteins present in wheat products in much smaller amounts than gluten, might also play a role in inflammatory diseases. These proteins can stimulate immune reactions in the gut, causing the release of inflammatory molecules that then move through the bloodstream to boost existing inflammatory processes, particularly the activation of immune T cells in other organs. Okay, so whenever you're activating T cells, you know that MS is particularly sensitive to that. In a study published last year, the researchers explored the possible effects of ATI on inflammation in a mouse model of MS. The results showed that an ATI-containing diet exacerbated disease severity in the mice. Meanwhile, gluten itself did not appear to influence disease severity relative to a control diet without these proteins. Now that's interesting. So if you're able to separate the gluten from the ATI, it's the ATI that's causing the trouble, not the gluten. I guess that's what they're saying. Dietary ATI also was found to promote the infiltration of pro-inflammatory immune cells into the central nervous system. When cells taken from MS patients were incubated with ATI in the lab, the release of inflammatory molecules was promoted. They say that a wheat-free diet can reduce the severity of MS and other inflammatory diseases, but further studies combining a wheat-free diet with other drug therapies, among other things, are planned. Well, I suppose it's high time that I give you some idea of what foods we might be consuming that are inflammatory, and better yet, ones that we might be consuming that are anti-inflammatory. So I went out to the Johns Hopkins website. I found a helpful article, Anti-Inflammatory Diet. And skipping down to the section on inflammatory foods, I think this is the part that we really want to know about. What foods cause inflammation? And there are a lot of them. She says that in particular, avoid these inflammatory foods: red meat such as steak and hamburgers, processed meat such as bologna, bacon, sausage meat, and lunch meat, commercial baked goods such as snack cakes, pies, cookies, and brownies, bread and pasta made with white flour, deep fried items such as French fries, fried chicken, and donuts, foods high in added sugar such as candy, jelly, and syrup, sugar-sweetened beverages such as soda, bottled or canned tea drinks, and sports drinks. And finally, trans fats found in margarine, microwave popcorn, refrigerated biscuits, and dough, and non-dairy coffee creamers. I think as you look at this list, an awful lot of what you're seeing are things that are not made from scratch at home, right? A lot of the stuff that's pre-prepared, it's more convenient in many ways, but it's also not as healthy quite often because some of the good stuff's taken out, some bad stuff's put in, whatever. But even things like bread and pasta, some people make those at home, but if you make them using white flour, you're still getting the bad inflammatory compounds in them. When I buy bread, I will buy Ezekiel bread. It's not the only kind that's made of sprouted grains, but it is one of the more well-known. And I will tell you, it's not cheap. None of the sprouted grain breads are, but it's tasty and healthy. And I guess, for me, I'm not willing to compromise too much on taste just to be healthy. There are so many good foods and good for you foods that overlap. There's no point in eating something that tastes like cardboard just to avoid eating the inflammatory ingredients that these conveniently packaged foods have. And then as far as pasta, I tend not to buy the regular flour-based pastas. I end up buying a lot of the ones that are made from chickpeas or made from lentils, because while I'm sure they're not perfectly healthy, let's face it, nothing that you buy with a barcode on it is healthy. I'm going to go almost that far. You could probably find exceptions, but I think for the most part, you're pretty safe in saying if it's got a barcode on it, probably has something in it you don't want to eat. But those are much more healthy than the white flour ones, and they don't contain the inflammatory components that they're talking about here. Cooking methods can make a difference, and I think that's important to keep in mind. And we don't need to go through this whole paragraph, but what they say right here in the beginning, when you want to reduce inflammation, baking, steaming, or fast stir frying are preferable to deep frying or grilling. I had heard another rule of thumb that cooking with water is better than cooking what they call dry cooking, because water boils at a certain temperature and nothing's going to make the thing hotter than the temperature at which water boils. But if you're cooking something dry, like on a grill, it can get quite a bit hotter, and cancer-causing components can happen when you do that. And then they're going to talk about processed foods. I'm going to link this article because there's a lot of good information, but I'm not going to read every word of it. But let's just look at the headings. This is the important part here for us too, the anti-inflammatory foods. We've talked quite a bit today about foods that are inflammatory, but what can we eat that's not inflammatory? Well, foods that are high in omega-3 fatty acids are really good for that. And fatty fish, salmon, herring, mackerel, sardines, tuna, striped bass, anchovies. I know a lot of people do not like anchovies, but I am one of the few, and my husband is too. We like anchovies, so I guess that's one thing we don't have to compromise on. And then vitamin C. Keep your vitamin C levels up as best you can. But even though vitamin C is fairly widespread, it could cause other problems if you just drink big, tall glasses of orange juice all day long, because there's an awful lot of fructose and other less than healthy ingredients added to commercial orange juice. So eat a whole orange, or there's many other foods. Yeah, a lot of fruits and vegetables have vitamin C. And oh, bell peppers, yes. They've mentioned bell peppers, and I love bell peppers. They're high in vitamin C, and they're just very fun to eat. Polyphenols. Well, you don't find that on the shelf in the grocery store, so how do you find polyphenols? It says here, some examples would be colorful plant-based foods, whole grains, and olive oil. So polyphenols are exclusively found in plant-type products. So they also talk here about coffee, tea, and even dark chocolate. So see, you don't have to eat a boring diet just so that you can be healthy. And then other gut healthy foods that they talk about here would include fermented foods, although not all fermented foods have the probiotics in them, but you have to check the label and all that. Things like yogurt and cottage cheese, sauerkraut, soy sauce would be considered fermented foods that could actually be quite beneficial. And her final point here, I think, echoes what we heard earlier, that in terms of well-known diets, the Mediterranean diet may be the most beneficial in helping people get inflammation under control. It emphasizes omega-3s, vitamin C's, polyphenols, fiber-rich foods, and other known inflammation fighters. But for those who want to start gradually, one strategy is substitution, finding alternatives to foods that cause inflammation. So she has a nice little table here. I am not going to go through all of this. I'm going to link the article, and that way you can go and check this out, because each of us has a different idea of what makes a satisfying meal. And so some of these substitutions just might not do it for you. But as she says here at the bottom, no one food reduces inflammation, but building a healthy, holistic dietary pattern can help lower your risk of inflammatory disease and transform your health. Well, okay, so now we know that choices we make about the kinds of foods we eat and the foods we avoid could make a difference for us in our inflammation and the inflammation's effect on depression and anxiety. Who knew, right? So that's a takeaway from this, if nothing else is. But I hope that you will explore that list of foods that are good for us, that are good to avoid. Do the best you can to enjoy your meals and yet keep yourself as healthy as possible. Because you know what I always say, we need to be taking really good care of our general health so our quality of life is as strong as it possibly can be, so that no matter what MS throws at us, at least it's hitting a solid wall and not one that's likely to fall down because of something else. And that's all I have for you today. But I look forward to seeing you again in my next video.